Macon County, Alabama, 1932. The Great Depression has already torn through rural America, but here in the Black Belt, it hits different. Sharecroppers are living on land they will never own, working soil that barely feeds their families, watching their children die from diseases that have cures everywhere else. Pellagra, tuberculosis, syphilis. These are not medical mysteries. They are what happens when an entire population gets locked out of hospitals, doctors, and basic care. Then the government shows up. The United States Public Health Service arrives with nurses, doctors, and an offer: free medical exams, free treatment, hot meals on exam days, burial insurance worth $50. For men who have never seen a government program that gave them anything, this looks like help finally arrived. They sign up. They trust it. They tell their neighbors. By the end of recruitment, 600 men have enrolled. Most people think this was a medical program that failed, a study that went wrong, doctors who made mistakes or lost track of their patients over time. That is not what happened. The Public Health Service designed a study to watch what untreated syphilis does to the human body over decades. They recruited 399 men who had syphilis and 201 men without it. They told none of them the truth. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood. That was the local term for a dozen different ailments: weakness, fatigue, aches. The researchers used that confusion on purpose. They gave the men spinal taps, which are painful and dangerous, and called them special treatments. They gave them aspirin and iron supplements and told them it was medicine for their condition. They offered burial stipends because they needed the men to stay in the program until they died. They needed the autopsies. That was the data they wanted. This was never medicine. It was observation. The official name of the study was the Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. Untreated. That word was in the title from day one. The study was supposed to last 6 to 9 months. Just long enough to document the disease and then treat everyone. It lasted 40 years. It continued through World War II. It continued through the discovery of penicillin. It continued after penicillin became the standard cure for syphilis and was widely available. In 1947, 15 years into the study, the Public Health Service made a choice. Penicillin existed. It was safe. It worked. The researchers decided to keep watching instead of healing. They did not passively forget to treat these men. They actively prevented them from getting treatment anywhere else. When men were drafted into military service during the war, the draft boards tried to treat their syphilis. That was mandatory. The researchers contacted the draft boards and got exemptions. They pulled the men out of treatment. They sent letters to local doctors asking them not to treat anyone enrolled in the study. They built a system to ensure the men stayed sick. This required paperwork, coordination, institutional agreement across multiple agencies. It was not one rogue doctor. It was not a secret. Between 1932 and 1972, researchers published at least 13 papers about the Tuskegee study in medical journals. They presented findings at conferences. Other doctors read the work, cited it, and said nothing. The study was reviewed multiple times by committees who voted to continue. In 1969, the Centers for Disease Control inherited oversight of the program and kept it running. The men kept coming to their appointments. They believed Miss Rivers when she told them they were receiving care. Eunice Rivers was a black nurse from Tuskegee Institute. She was the only constant presence across all 40 years. She scheduled appointments. She drove men to exams. She visited their homes. She attended their funerals. The researchers knew something crucial. White doctors could not build trust in this community, but Miss Rivers could. She was one of them. She spoke their language. She knew their families. The men trusted her completely. She believed, at least at first, that she was helping them access medical care they could not get otherwise. The researchers used that belief. They turned her genuine care into the instrument that kept men inside a study designed to watch them die. By 1972, at least 28 men had died directly from syphilis. Another 100 died from related complications. 40 of their wives contracted the disease. 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. The study ended because a whistleblower named Peter Buxton went to the press. Not because the government stopped it. Buxton had filed complaints internally in 1966. A committee reviewed his objections and voted unanimously to continue the study. He waited 6 years and then leaked it to the Associated Press. The story broke in July 1972. Only then did it stop. Not a single researcher was ever criminally charged. You need to understand how they kept this going for 40 years. The original researchers retired. New ones took over. Administrations changed. Medical knowledge evolved. Penicillin went from experimental to standard to cheap and available at any clinic. Through all of that, the study continued. Not because one evil person forced it, because hundreds of people in hospitals, universities, and government offices decided every single day to let it keep going. Start with Eunice Rivers. Most people never learn her name. She was a black nurse, trained at Tuskegee Institute, hired in 1932 when the study launched. She stayed until 1972. 40 years. She knew every man in the study personally. She drove them to appointments. She brought them aspirin when they were sick. She visited their homes. She sat with their families. When they died, she attended the funerals. The men loved her. They called her Miss Rivers. When she asked them to come in for an exam, they came. When she said the doctors were helping them, they believed her. The researchers knew exactly what they were doing when they hired her. A white doctor from the Public Health Service could not walk into these communities and build trust. But Miss Rivers could. She was one of them. She spoke their language. She understood their lives. The researchers wrote memos about this. They documented that her race and her relationships were essential to keeping men in the study. They were using her. And she did not fully understand that until much later. Maybe not ever. Rivers believed for years that she was helping these men access medical care they could not get otherwise. In her mind, the exams and the attention and even the small payments were more than these men had ever received from the medical system. She was not lying to them out of cruelty. She was lying to them because she had been lied to about what the study was. That is how these things work. You do not need everyone to understand the full picture. You just need each person to believe their small part is justified. Now, go to 1947. Penicillin is widely available. It cures syphilis in nearly every case. It is safe. It is effective. Doctors are using it everywhere. The war is over, and pharmaceutical production has ramped up. You can get penicillin at rural clinics across the South. This is the moment the study transforms. Before penicillin, the researchers could tell themselves they were just observing a disease that was difficult to treat anyway. The existing treatments used arsenic and bismuth. They were painful. They took months. They did not always work. After penicillin, that excuse dies. Now the researchers have to actively stop men from getting cured. They contact local doctors. They send letters asking them not to treat anyone enrolled in the Tuskegee study. They explain that these men are part of an important research project and that treatment would compromise the data. Some doctors agree. Some probably never question it. During World War II, several men in the study get drafted. The military requires syphilis testing and treatment before service. Standard procedure, the researchers intervene. They get the men exempted from treatment. They pull them out of the military medical pipeline. They document this in memos. One researcher writes that they need to protect the study from interference. The men are given placebos, pink pills, shots of distilled water, vitamins. The researchers call these treatments. Miss Rivers tells the men they are receiving medicine. The men believe they are being healed. They are not. The study is published over and over. Between 1936 and 1973, at least 13 papers appear in medical journals. Researchers present findings at conferences. They discuss the progression of untreated syphilis in black men. They share autopsy results. They compare disease stages. The papers are read by thousands of doctors. Some of those doctors cite the research in their own work. No one objects. No one writes a letter to the editor. No one stands up at a conference and says this is wrong. The study is not a secret. It is operating inside the normal channels of American medicine. In 1969, the Centers for Disease Control takes over oversight. The CDC is a new agency built to protect public health. They review the study. They decide to continue it. A committee meets. They discuss whether the research still has value. They vote. The study continues. That same year, a public health service investigator named Peter Buxton starts asking questions. Buxton is white. He is young. He works in venereal disease control. In 1966, he files a formal complaint. He writes that the study is unethical. He argues that the men are being harmed. He says someone needs to stop this. His complaint goes to a committee. The committee includes doctors, public health officials, and researchers. They meet in 1969. They review his concerns. They vote unanimously to continue the study. Their reasoning is documented. They argue that the study has been running for decades and that stopping now would waste all that data. They say, the men are too old to benefit much from treatment anyway. They decide that seeing the study through to completion is more valuable than treating the remaining participants. This is not one psychopath making a choice. This is a room full of professionals agreeing that research matters more than the lives in front of them. Buxton tries again in 1968. He is ignored. He waits. In 1972, he contacts a reporter named Jean Heller at the Associated Press. He gives her the whole story. Heller publishes it in July 1972. The article is front-page news. Congress holds hearings. The public is outraged. The study ends. Not because the institution stopped it, because a whistleblower forced it into the light. By then, 28 men have died directly from syphilis. Another 100 have died from heart disease, blindness, and organ failure caused by untreated infection. 40 wives have been infected. 19 children have been born with congenital syphilis. The study collected decades of data about what happens when you let a curable disease destroy a human body. Here is what most people think happens when something like this gets exposed. They think there are trials. They think people go to prison. They think the system corrects itself because the truth came out. That is not what happened. In 1973, the survivors and the families of dead participants filed a class action lawsuit. It took until 1974 to settle. The government agreed to pay $10 million total. Each surviving participant got $37,500. The families of men who had died got $15,000. Do the math on that. A man who was deliberately kept sick for decades, who infected his wife, who watched his children born with a disease he did not know he had, got less than $40,000. The government paid that money and called it settled. Not one researcher was charged with a crime. Not one doctor lost their medical license. Not one government official faced any legal consequence. The lawyers and bureaucrats treated this like a liability case. Like when someone slips in a store and sues. They calculated the value of the harm. They wrote a check. They moved on. Nobody called it murder. Nobody called it torture. Nobody used the word experiment without consent on human beings. The legal system looked at 40 years of deliberate medical harm and decided it was a civil matter. Fred Gray was the lawyer who represented the men. He had also represented Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. He got them money because money was all the system would give. But he said later that justice was never done. You cannot pay someone for stealing their life. Congress held hearings in 1973. Senator Ted Kennedy led them. Doctors and officials testified. They explained how the study worked. They admitted no one had ever gotten consent. They admitted penicillin had been withheld. They said they had not realized it was unethical at the time. That last part is a lie. Peter Buxton told them it was unethical in 1966. They voted to continue. The hearings led to the creation of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. That is where modern informed consent rules come from. The idea that researchers must tell you what they are doing and get your permission before using you in a study. That did not exist as law before Tuskegee forced it into existence. The rules we have now exist because of what happened to these men. They paid for it with their lives and their families. The government apologized in 1997, 25 years after the study ended. Bill Clinton stood in the White House with 5 survivors. Herman Shaw was there. He was 94. Charlie Pollard was there. Carter Howard was there. Fred Simmons was there. George Key was there. Clinton said the government had done something profoundly and morally wrong. He said it on behalf of the American people. The men accepted the apology. What else could they do? Most of their friends from the study were already dead. Herman Shaw said he had prayed for an apology. He said he was glad it finally came, but he also said it did not give him back his health. It did not bring back the men who died. It was just words. The last survivor, Ernest Hendon, died in 2004. He was 96. By then, every single man who had been part of the study was gone. The settlement money was spent. The apology was decades old. What remains is the legacy. Black Americans, especially in the South, do not trust medical institutions the way white Americans do. That is not paranoia. That is pattern recognition. The Tuskegee study is taught in medical schools now as an ethics case. Students learn what not to do. But here is what they often do not learn. The study was not an outlier. It was normal for its time. Medical experiments on black patients without consent happened in multiple states across decades. Forced sterilizations, surgical experiments, drug trials. Tuskegee was not unique. It was just the one that got exposed. Eunice Rivers lived until 1986. She never fully accepted that she had been used. In interviews late in her life, she said she helped those men. She said she gave them care they would not have gotten otherwise. She believed that until she died. That is what happens when you are inside a system that treats human beings like data. You learn to see the small kindnesses you offer and ignore the larger harm you are part of. She was not evil. She was loyal to an institution that lied to her about what it was doing. The researchers were not monsters. They were professionals who believed their work mattered more than the individuals in front of them. They published papers. They attended conferences. They advanced their careers. They went home to their families. They probably thought of themselves as good people doing important work. That is the part you need to sit with. Evil does not require cruelty. It just requires looking at a human being and seeing a data point. It requires institutions that reward you for collecting information and do not punish you for the harm you cause getting it. It requires a system where the people with power never face consequences and the people without power never get justice. 40 years, 400 men, 28 dead from the disease itself, 100 more from complications, 40 wives infected, 19 children born sick, not one person held accountable. That is how it works.